Welcome back, everyone, to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We've been talking about saving for college. We've been talking about curriculum planning and AP and IB courses, but now it's the segment all of you seniors have been waiting for. We want to talk about this whole idea of reapplying. And joining me for that is my very seasoned colleague, Jen Simons, who is a former admissions officer at Tufts, Northeastern, Barnard, and Connecticut College. And she also happens to be a former school counselor, so I know she's had these conversations before. Hi, Jen.
Hi, it's great to see you, Beth.
You too. All right, so we were chatting the other day about this a little bit of a phenomenon that we see every year, right? Which is a student gets their decisions back. And by the way, all of our students listening now who are seniors have gotten their decisions back. And they're disappointed and they didn't get their top choice or any of their top choices. And they are thinking that rather than take one of the options that they do have, they're going to sit it out and reapply. And I wanted to let's start there. What do you think about that in general?
Well, I mean, certainly I tell students all the time during the application process that nothing is forever, nothing is written in stone. You have control over what can seem like a very uncontrollable process. And so, certainly this is the time where you can exercise that control that you have as you find yourself with a decision to make, or maybe you don't have a decision to make, quite frankly. We hope that that doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. The first thing that I would really encourage students, though, with a school counselor or someone that can help them, is to assess the decisions they do have. So
Mhm.
this year, as you said, I've been doing this a very long time, and I think you'll agree with me that this year felt like one of the most competitive years.
Mhm.
And we could talk about what that could be due to in another segment, but really, I think a lot of students were disappointed, i- and not irrationally. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
thinking that they would get into places. I mean, of course, they're students. Everybody has expectations, and maybe you reach too high or whatever the case may be. But I think that in many cases, students were sort of, they must have been in the ballpark, right? There are a lot of
Mhm.
wait lists,
Mhm.
more seemingly than ever. So basically, before you sort of make a decision, you have to assess what your goals are. And if your goals are to get into the colleges that denied you, you really have to look at those acceptance rates, because there's very little potentially that can be done if a school is just not in your range. And again, we're talking about schools with 6, 7, 8% acceptance rates, but also schools, depending on the students, with higher acceptance rates. So you really have to make an informed decision, rather than say, well, I'm just going to reapply, which sometimes students want to do.
Right, right. And I think to that end, one of the things that comes to mind for me too is looking at your process. Was it a thoughtful process? Did you take the right amount of time to work on each application? Did you hit the deadlines that you needed to hit? For me, those bigger state schools with early action deadlines or rolling admissions, you need to hit those early deadlines. You need your application to be in early. If you kind of dragged your feet and you were really late, maybe there might be an advantage to be gained by being more on top of things. But if it was a perfectly executed process, basically you did everything that you're supposed to do in the time frame you are supposed to do it. To me, that is a really important moment, as you say, to assess. You know, what has really happened here, and is there room for there to be a change, for the decision to go differently?
Mhm.
um, which is a tricky thing because we have a lot more perspective than the average student does, and so you know I don't know. What do you think about the strategy of reapplying rather than me hemming and hawing?
No, no, no.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that it's definitely a good strategy. I mean, the first thing, of course, there are all different scenarios, but the first thing that I would have any student do, let's say you really didn't get any positive decisions or you're really unhappy,
Yeah.
there are still colleges and universities that are accepting students. And so this doesn't mean that they're not as strong. This doesn't mean, I mean, there are, what is it, over 3,000 colleges in the US. And, sometimes decisions get made and they don't have a class, whatever. So, first thing I would do is look to see which colleges and universities are still accepting students. And also, many large universities, speaking to your point about the rolling admission cycle, accept students for the spring. So,
Mhm.
that could be a possible option as well without you even having to do a thing. You could reapply for the spring semester. Um, the other two sort of most common things that students mention or think about next are the option of taking a gap year
Mhm.
and reapplying, or going to a college somewhere, whether it's a community college or a four-year college, and then applying as a transfer student. And those are two very different paths.
Mhm.
Um, I want to, taking a gap year for anyone that wants to defer admission for a year, let's say, is a very, very good option for discovering yourself, for having a job, for doing anything that you want to do to improve yourself. But for a student that isn't happy with their results, taking a gap year might enable them to beef up parts of their application that were not as strong. Again, this is where the assessment comes in. You have to know
Right.
what your weaknesses are. You also have to be careful during your gap year and not enroll in a community college or a college and university, because
Right.
then you're putting yourself into that second category, which is the transfer category. But let's say you think to yourself, one of my weaknesses, I got a C in my fourth year of Spanish, and I really want to prove to them that this is something I can do and it's something I enjoy. Going on an abroad program or organized or on your own to Spain and doing something that you put together can be very helpful and valuable. However, what I want to caution against with these programs, and this is important, this is a good reason why you have to talk to somebody, is that the deadlines might come up sooner for college admission than the amount of time that you've spent abroad in this case, or
Mhm.
wherever. So, particularly for those early decision deadlines, as students might remember from this year, or rolling, they can happen even before you might leave for your gap year or something like
Right.
that. So you might not have enough of your experiences under your belt to really make a difference in those early action, early decision, or rolling, early pools. So that's just something to think about. I'll pause for a second, Beth, and let you let you say something.
Well, I think also what's interesting about that is it kind of touches on this idea of what does it mean to reapply, right? I think for some students, I've had some students come to me and say, "Yeah, I'm just going to reapply to these schools, and really loved my essay, so I'm going to go with the same essay." And I mean, reapplying is crafting an entirely new
Yeah.
application, and because the first one didn't work,
Hmm.
so that it needs to be different, right? So you're looking at new essays, and to your point, if you're planning a gap year and you're thinking that you're going to have this really great experience that you're going to talk about in your applications, well, if you are a week into your gap year experience and you have to have a finished essay for applications, guess what? That's not helping, right?
Hmm.
You also probably are going to want different recommendation letters. You are probably going to want to be augmenting your list of activities. And so, realistically, it is April of your senior year. What can you accomplish between now and when your first applications might be due, as early as, let's even say, October? Because some of those early action deadlines might be as early as October 15th, and rolling admissions might start as early as September 1st.
The most important thing for every student, whether you're reapplying, going to college, is making sure you finish on a strong a good note, a solid note. So really making sure that your senior year ends the same way it began, if it began in a strong way. But basically, you can't look at your senior year, even if you're planning on reapplying, but maybe especially if you're planning on reapplying, as an opportunity to slack off. So having said that, that's like point number one. But I think your point is very well taken about the application has to be different. That is really the most important thing. You cannot be the same applicant that applied and got waitlisted or denied. Although I would say, I'm going to just correct myself. There are cases that I've worked with students. I worked with a very, very strong transfer this year who got deferred from a university and then got waitlisted from a
Mm-hmm.
university. So she was in their pool from November all the way, and she actually stayed on the wait list until June when they told her there wasn't a place for her. So she was part of that,
Right.
applicant pool for almost a year, essentially. And so I think that you have a better chance, potentially, if you're in a situation like this, waitlisted or deferred, and you can show that you've applied before. Again, it's a different application. Your application wasn't strong enough. The
Right.
applicant pool is probably only going to get stronger. But at least I think that if you can, if there's still a university or college that you really love that you were waitlisted at, that might be definitely something you put on your application and could make your application stronger, in the sense that colleges like to know that you're still interested in them in a significant way.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. And I would say I had an experience probably 2 years ago where I worked with a young woman who was a really strong student. And I think it was a combination of not great advice, but also her essays were not great. She wrote about, in my opinion, the wrong things. She didn't highlight some of the really unique and interesting things she had done. And so the approach that we took, well, partially, she really took a long, hard look at her list of colleges and was a lot more mature in her approach, and eliminated some that she realized were kind of just there because of the name brand. But I also encouraged her, and she did eliminate all of the schools who had denied her outright, because I just didn't think that, even though there were missed opportunities, that they were great enough that it would warrant a school pulling out her old application, putting it with the new one, and that they were suddenly going to say, "Oh my goodness, what were we thinking?" So she focused on places where she had been waitlisted, and then also a couple of additional schools that she had been hanging out in the back of her mind, but that now she sort of felt like, yeah, these make sense. And then she also extended something really interesting that she had been doing that summer into the fall. So she was going to do a very expensive gap year program, year abroad. And instead, in talking to her and finding out what she was doing, my advice was, see if they will keep you on for another 4 or 5 months. Save your $45,000, which is how much that program was going to cost.
Wow.
Do this instead, which, oh, by the way, you're getting paid for. And again, we'll never know for sure if which of those things or all of those decisions, but I do believe they definitely impacted her positively. She also made a much better strategic decision with her early chip, right? So she was in a position financially where they could afford early decision. And whereas the previous year she had done single choice early action or restricted early action, this time around she went with the early decision, and that came through for her. And so she did a lot of different things that I think really bolstered her. But one of the big ones was that she got rid of the schools that had outright denied her and focused instead almost exclusively on the places that had given her a waitlist decision. So I'm with you on that. I think that is a really important piece.
And it's interesting to note the student I worked with was actually a transfer student, so she did enroll someplace, and she had credits to transfer, and so two different situations with good results.
Right, exactly. Any other last bits of thoughts around, this whole concept of, wow, I'm really unhappy, I'm just going to reapply? Any other steps that they should be thinking about, or questions that they should be asking themselves?
Well, I definitely think that, this isn't the time for me to say, bloom where you're planted. And, if you don't love the schools that you're at, like, think about why, like, or that you've been accepted to, think about why. I think that it's going to be a very different process if you are not in a high school. I mean, students don't
Hmm.
necessarily realize how much harder it is to apply when you are sort of on your own and maybe in a different country, or, that you don't have the sort of natural setting. But in some ways, the pressure is off because you also don't have all your friends applying with you, and the competition level. So it can be a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, ultimately, you have to decide what your happiness level is, but you can't defer, just so you know, from a school that you've been admitted to and then reapply other
Hmm.
places. So
Yes.
that comes up every year. Parents say, can my student, admit, say, yes, I'm coming, take a gap year and apply? Absolutely not. You have to say no thank you to any affirmative decisions you've gotten, and move ahead as if you're starting from scratch. And that's a good way to think about it. If I could leave them with one thing, that based off of your point, you're almost starting from scratch because it needs to be a very different application.
Yes, I totally agree. Jen, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of my guests. Next week, Sally is here. She's hosting. We're going to be talking about using Naviance, making the best use of that if that's a system your school uses. Athletic scholarships. We're going to have another story from our team. This one from one of my colleagues who is a first generation student and whose parents were immigrants. So added to an extra level of complication to her process, although perhaps it added an extra lovely layer to her experience. So she's going to tell us about that. And don't forget, we are here every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.